rise above the static, dissecting issues diplomatic. With mics in hand, they brave the storm of clashing views and norms transform. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining lights on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. From climate change to foreign ties, they pause the spinning and sift the lies. No stone unturned, no topic taboo, as left and right come into view.
Hey everybody, it's Razib Khan with conversation number 25. It's 25, right?
It is 25, yes.
So we're not quite halfway through our 52-week commitment, but we're almost there. So yeah, how you feeling about that so far?
It's good, it's 25, Project 25. In the year 2020, 25, if man is still alive, if woman survive, probably will not still be going on then, but
yeah, I mean, so we are as we're recording, we're like, is this almost the last week of the Biden regime administration?
I think we will have one more before the inauguration, because the inauguration's on the 20th. It's like it'll be a couple days before, I think.
Yeah. So this is kind of like the common for storm. One thing that I do wonder about, we don't really talk about, the napping administration, the Biden administration too much. We haven't, but, it's kind of like time for some retrospectives. I haven't thought too deeply about it. They did pass a lot of legislation. They did spend a lot of money. Whether that was good or bad is a different issue, but they did do, with the Democratic Congress in the first 2 years, they did do a lot of what they set out to do. Actually, to a greater extent than was expected, because nobody thought that they would win both Georgia seats in the Senate.
Right.
And so, just to recap for people who don't remember or not American, the Biden administration, they were elected, supposed to be normalcy, and then there were some special elections in Georgia, and against expectation, both of them went for the Democrats.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, with the tiebreaker, they had the votes in the Senate to pass some big legislation, and Biden kind of went for it. He got most of what he wanted. Unfortunately, first of all, a lot of the money is not spent yet, because the whole regime of the bureaucracy takes a while to spend money. But the second issue is probably was not needed to that extent, if at all, with our inflationary problems, right? So they did something that they don't really talk about as much anymore, partly because it's connected to some problems with inflation, which probably was aside from her candidate issues, probably was the number one reason Kamala Harris lost, was the inflation. But when people say it's a failed administration, I mean, maybe, but they actually kind of achieved what they set out to do. So, it's like they swung, and they went up to bat, they tried.
Yeah. It's an interesting, the administration, I would say, was interesting in a number of respects. First, what commonly happens in presidential runs and in other elections as well is you kind of play to the base during the primary, and then in the general election, you move more towards the center, right? So, in a Democratic primary, what you would normally expect is for the candidate to kind of play up their left-wing policies and credentials during the primary, and then you kind of try and move to the center ground during the general election campaign. And with Biden, it was kind of the opposite, in that his campaign, he ran as one of the more centrist, moderate Democrat candidates. He was running first against the whole panoply of people, and then at the end, he was supposed to be the alternative to Bernie, kind of like a stable or whatnot. And certainly his reputation, if you look at his record, if the fact that he's like just an old white guy from Delaware in the 70s or whatever, I think there was no reason for him to do anything particularly left wing or even anything particularly ambitious. I think a lot of people, they were not voting for Biden. They were voting against Trump. They wanted Trump out. They wanted normalcy, as you say, kind of like a return. And so I think the administration could have, if it wanted, could have just been like, just chill, try and handle COVID stuff, other things, get like society back to normal and whatnot. But instead, probably because of staffing and who knows why, but they decided to go like, they really bought into a lot of, what we would now call like woke DEI type stuff. And I think they kind of drank their own Kool-Aid on a lot of these issues, like the border, inflation. That's an issue where, okay, so to some degree, I think inflation was going to be an issue just because all the money that got spent during the pandemic. But they doubled down and are very early in the term passed this huge American Rescue Plan, which Larry Summers said at the time, hey, if you do this, this is going to really juice up the inflation rate. So that was kind of an unforced error. The border stuff really is completely an unforced error, I would say. The border situation was kind of under control. Some of that was due to the pandemic, but some of it was because Trump had negotiated a deal with Mexico, the Remain in Mexico policy. So people who wanted to claim asylum had to do it there. So you didn't have this problem. A lot of the border problems are downstream from abuses of the asylum situation, right? Where people get to the US and they have come illegally, but they claim, oh, hey, I have, there's like magic words you can say. I have like a, reasonable fear of persecution. And then there's a process that they have to go through. And if there are hundreds of thousands of people every month who are doing it, they're like, okay, well, we'll give you a court date in 5 years. And in the meantime, just have a nice life living in America. And Remain in Mexico was an attempt to kind of address that. Obviously, I think it would have been pretty easy for the Biden administration to keep that. It's much easier than if they had to negotiate it themselves, right? But they could have just kept in place a lot of the Trump stuff, maybe changed tweaked a few things to kind of bolster their liberal credentials or whatever. But so that seems like that's a huge unforced error. And in terms of the foreign policy stuff, it's hard to say. Foreign policy is tricky, so it's hard to say what was baked in the cake, what was a result of the administration's actions. But it's just the facts on the ground are that for all the bluster and warnings and other stuff, during the Trump administration, things were pretty quiet. And there was actually some advances in things like the Abraham Accords. And under Biden, we withdrew from Afghanistan, which I think was the right decision. The withdrawal was very chaotic, and people have different opinions about, was that inevitable? Was that incompetence, whatever? But that was obviously not a good look for the administration. And then you have stuff in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and other places. Even now, like, it seems like everybody is trying to get in their like coup or whatever, war or whatever before Trump takes office. So there's just like a lot of chaos, and maybe some of that was going to happen anyway. But you have to figure, like, the fact that you have a president who can't actually do cabinet meetings, he can't do, like, it's like, Biden, because of his cognitive issues or whatever, it's not like a normal American president, he could call up Putin on the hotline, right? Or he could, and like talk to him one-on-one, or he could do other stuff that Biden was just not capable of doing. And you have to think that played a role, perhaps, in, being provocative in terms like, people thought, oh, here's our chance. We can get away with more.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I'm just going to talk a little about the personnel issue, and I think that the personnel issue is you can't separate the personnel issue from the age issue. The two are amplifying. When I realized personnel was a real problem in terms of who they have is when Build Back Better was being proposed, there was leaks coming out to the press that some people on the staff were worried that it was going to be disparate impact and favor white males because they work in construction. And that's when I realized, oh, these people are like in a retarded bubble. Like, have you gone to a construction site?
Yeah.
It's not, it's like, it's guys from Mexico. I mean, frankly, it's like a lot of Latino guys now, They're obviously the type of people that are not around construction sites, do not know working class people, and they're worried that this is going to have a white supremacist outcome. Like, first of all, that's like showing how stupid you are, that's your primary concern. But it's also showing a lack of awareness about the world beyond your little bubble. If Biden was 45 or 50 or 55, he would not have made that error because he does actually come from that world.
Right.
But I think the problem here is, the administration near the end admitted that he took a lot of naps. He was not on his A game, like after 8 p.m., like before 2 p.m. Look ridiculous, right? So obviously, this is an issue where he wasn't quite a symbolic monarch, but he made some really high level, commands, and then he had to have other people execute. He could never be a micromanager because he had no energy. In contrast, like, we're old enough to remember, Clinton, for example.
Yeah.
I think it's somewhat in contrast to Bush, the second Bush. Clinton was like known to like get involved in things a little too much, probably causing problems. But part of it was he's a smart young guy with a lot of energy.
Right.
You can imagine Bill Clinton like knowing pretty much everything that's going on in the administration at a certain level, at a certain level of depth. Whereas, Bush, under George W. Bush, he was a more laissez-faire, but he also had certain things he was obviously focused on. Whereas with Biden, I think this is just what they call a skill issue.
Right.
He wasn't going to be able to keep track of like more than one thing, maybe like one foreign policy thing that he had the energy for. And so the administration was running on autopilot. And near the end, there were Democratic pundits, Democratic aligned pundits, and people in the administration that were saying, "This is a feature; it's not a bug. Like, we have this whole system, and it's like your Waymo or your Tesla autopilot or something." It's like, okay, but this is not like driverless cars. Like, this is the most powerful nation in the world. I think that was like really disturbing people.
Yeah, I think that was disturbing, and it would be. It's there's kind of like multiple factors. Maybe it would have worked better if you had had a more competent staff, but in addition to having a president who was kind of scaled back and had his own difficulties, the problem is that like the staffing, I don't know that they were the best and the brightest, but you also had a dynamic which was, you're talking about the peak woke period. So this is true throughout the culture, but particularly in Democratic circles where it was almost like the 24-year-olds were calling the shots, like if you're a undersecretary of something, and you do something and people are like, well, no, you can't do that because of intersectionality or whatever. People were kind of enthralled to these left-wing cultural ideas. That's, now, it is one thing that I like to do that I think is very important for people is periodically, I will go back a year or a couple years, whatever the date is, and I will, read the papers or magazines from that date or that period, or I'll listen to some podcasts from that period, just to like refresh my recollection and get a sense of like what, because we're also like focused on the present, what the like cause of the week is. This is why you're listening to the conversations now, so you can find out what's been happening this week and get insightful commentary and analysis on it. But it's very useful to go back and listen to it from a period where there's been a little disconnect, and you learn a couple of things. One thing that I think you learn is just how little people know about what's going to happen, because you'll listen to something that's right before some big news event, and if you listen to something from January 2020, obviously that's a good example. Like, nobody's talking about COVID. If you were to listen to something from August 2001, blah 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 blah. So that is, I think, a big thing. But in particular now, when I go back 2 or 3 years and I listen to something, it's stark, just like how much the like woke cringe factor is there. And I mean cringe not in the like slang term necessarily, but just like everybody is kind of like on eggshells, and there's like this huge amount of deference to these ideas, to the point that now is just like, it's weird. It would have seemed weird in 2019, right? Or certainly in like 2012.
Yeah.
And it definitely seems weird now, because it's like the fever is kind of broken a little bit on some of it. But yeah, so that I think also played a role, is that they had kind of, they were huffing like all sorts of stuff. And now, okay, there's been a broader cultural backlash to it, and people are like, actually, these ideas, a lot of them don't make any sense, and they're not popular, and you suck, and we're tired of it. But at that point, there was not. I think it was much harder back then for people to push back, particularly if you're in the Democratic Party. If you like you say, Build Back Better. Okay, it is a little silly for people to be worried about Build Back Better, because construction workers, they're worried about them being too many white men, but also, white men are also voters. It's like, why are you concerned about that?
Well, I mean, Biden's victory in 2020 was actually white voters shifted back, and in particular white men.
Right.
They still voted for Trump, but they shifted. Like the margins were not what.
Yes, I think white men. I think white men in 2020 was the only group where Biden improved on the Democrats' performance in 2016. Right? It's a relative measure, so obviously there's a lot of groups that he did very well with, but Trump did about as well, or maybe even better with like everybody but white men. So.
Yeah, I mean, the Matt Iglesias basically says the Biden administration. A lot of people read him, but he basically says it's weird. He was elected as a centrist, as in the primaries, and then he pivoted to the left.
Right.
But I mean, did he really pivot, or was it just the personnel? Just he's asleep on their shoulders. They just carry him. It seems like he focused on foreign policy. He obviously cared about Israel in a way that he wasn't going to let the staff bully him.
Right. Yeah.
But other stuff, he didn't care.
Right. Yeah. I mean, who knows? With a politician, it's not always easy to figure out what they really believe about something.
Well, I mean, so for example, with the trans stuff, he promoted it and said it was the next civil blah. It's like he didn't know anything about that 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
This is like, it's just
maybe. I don't know. Yeah, right. I mean, you would think, just as like I'm
pretty sure that he's one of those people that would confuse trans men and trans women like Richie Smith. All people just do not get it, right?
Yes, right.
I'm pretty sure he would not get it correctly aside from random chance. So, I mean, I think, he was promoting things that he like probably heard about from his granddaughter or something,
Right.
or his young staff.
I mean, it's the staff, yeah.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue that was happening is like I think people were just getting sick of not having a real president with a real vision. Whatever the vision is, you can vote for it or vote against it. But it was obvious that the throne was empty, and that was like exposed during the debate. And you know, I just think that that's going to, because like I said, there's a lot of stuff that was passed in the first 2 years. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
whether you like it or not, there's stuff that happened, but we don't think about that. We think about like, okay, this senile guy who was pushed out by his own party because he was too old. And this still hasn't happened yet. The exposés have been pretty minor, but I think there's going to be like deeper exposés as people get more distance about what they did to keep him in power, to keep him seeming less senile than he really was.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is objectively a pretty huge scandal, and it's a problem for all sorts of reasons. I will say, just this week, our neighbor to the north, Canada, their prime minister, Justin Trudeau, announced he was going to resign as head of the Liberal Party. They're about to head into an election of their own next month, I think it's going to be. And all the projections were that the Liberals were facing like near total wipeout. I think they have a parliamentary system. Fewer, they call them ridings as opposed to districts here. They have, I think, slightly fewer than we do in our House of Representatives, but it's like
We've got 40 million people, so it's still like way fewer people per district.
But
I think with Canada, it's first past the post, so that's why they can.
It is first past the post, yeah. And it looked like one of the projections I saw had them at 6 seats, right? So he has become almost universally hated there in Canada. He's resigning now in order to try and deflect some of that anger off of the Liberal Party. So maybe, they're going to lose, but maybe they don't lose by as much. The reason I bring that up is obviously whatever Trudeau's problems are, and there are many, he's not an old man. He's not senile as far as I can tell, right? So it's not like that, I think, is an issue with the Biden administration, and it's a scandal, and people should not forget about it, especially in terms of people who covered it up, both in government and in the media. But even if you had a 50-year-old Biden, just the global cultural left liberalism leads you to do all sorts of things that have made these parties that pursue these policies very, very unpopular. And so I don't think, certainly swapping Biden out for Kamala Harris did not end up working. And I kind of suspect that whoever had been within a broad range, whoever the Democrats had nominated in 2020 had been the president, they would have faced a lot of the same issues. Maybe like if like Bernie had won, who knows? Right? That's kind of like an out of sample type of thing. If Bloomberg had won, maybe that's out of sample. But if we were dealing with President Pete Buttigieg, I think you would have ended up with many of the same types of issues. If we were dealing with President Cory Booker, same.
Yeah. I think part of this issue is there was a period where the woke liberalism kind of used institutions to bully people into submission, and that moment is over. And now the water is retreated. It's quite clear that, like, let's say a third, being generous, of the population is on board with that stuff.
Right.
But 2/3 are not, and that includes a substantial, large minority of its own political coalition. Mostly the more downwardly mobile ethnic minorities, immigrants, etc. And so, they're in a conundrum because they really believe this stuff, and they live in kind of a socially homogenous bubble. I do think this does remind me of Republicans, for like generations, like less so now. They were kind of market fundamentalists. They believed in the power of the free market. I actually think that a lot of the merits, they were right. But the way they presented themselves sometimes seemed a bit heartless. And it was really hard, I think. The Republican Party, the right had to have a three-legged stool, a coalition between social conservatives and foreign policy. And part of the reason it had to do that is because that market fundamentalism, really when you got into the brass tacks of like privatizing Social Security and all these other things, stuff was not popular beyond that like third.
Right.
And it was the majority of the party, but there was a large minority that was like, we're here for the pro-life stuff, or we're here for, muscular foreign policy. And so I think that there's an analogy here with that because like, with the free market people, the people that are like at AEI and Heritage or Cato, they believe that stuff. They think it's actually good for people.
Right.
I kind of do actually myself, but I'm just saying like from a third party perspective, it wasn't popular. Similarly, they actually do think you should do your pronouns because that's polite.
Right.
Well, it's not like fake. They actually wanted to impose it on people. They did. And so they're in a conundrum here where because it's like some people that are more, let's just say, intellectually flexible. Like say someone like Matt Iglesias,
Right.
who like we both like him. Like we've met him. Like this is like no shade on him, but you could tell that he wasn't like totally on board with the woke stuff back then. But he was like,
I think that I think that there was it's not that they think, I suspect that there are very few people who think that pronouns are actually important. What I do think is that there is a bigger segment of the population who have a kind of like ideological system of deference, right? So if someone says you have to do pronouns because of XYZ marginal group, they either like, there are people like Iglesias who are just like, whatever, I'll just go along with it. But then there are also other people who are like, look, it's important for me. Like, I sincerely think we ought to do it. It's important for me because you've told me that there's this thing. And that I think can be hijacked is not the right word, but it can kind of lead in all sorts of weird directions. For example, there was, Meta, Facebook, Zuckerberg, he recently announced that they were going to change a lot of their moderation policies. They were getting rid of like the fact check program that they had been using to censor material on their site. They were moving some of their trust and safety team to Texas. I think they took the tampon dispensers out of the men's bathrooms, a bunch of stuff. But anyway, GLAAD, the gay rights organization, responded to this. And one of the things that they said in their, they were very critical, right, of it. And one of the things that they said in their press release was that Zuckerberg had used the, outdated and offensive term homosexual, right, to refer to gay people. Okay. So now,
Josiah, you're a heterosexual.
I am a heterosexual. Yeah.
Are you offended by that?
That's something. Okay. So that's absurd, right? Like there's nothing offensive about the term homosexual until 5 minutes ago. Like nobody, even at GLAAD, really would have said, like, I don't think like, oh, there's a problem with that term. But if GLAAD had put out that statement in, fall of 2020 or spring of 2021, there would have been a lot of people who would be like, oh, I was not aware, but now that I know that homosexual is an offensive term, I'm not going to use homosexual. And if someone else uses homosexual, I will call them out for their homosexual phobia or whatever. And that sort of deference, I think, has kind of lost its power with a lot of people, where they just was like, wait a minute. I think you're just making this up. I don't think, you say that this is offensive to people. I don't think you've even asked them.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of so I think we probably should mention just Matt Bruning's article, Identitarian Deference. I think it was originally, Bruning's a socialist, autistic guy. So just to give you some context, so his original article, "What Does Identitarian Deference Require," was published on February of 2013, so it was a little ahead of the time. He revisited it 4 years later. So the idea of identitarian deference, I have a really good example. Some of us are watching this, moderately obese female firefighter explain how it's good to have black women firefighters because it gives people more comfort when their house is burning down.
I'm going to try and play it. Can I try and play it?
Yeah, try and play it.
All right, let me see if I could play it.
You want to see somebody that responds to your house, your emergency, whether it's a medical call or a fire call, that look like you. It gives that person a little bit more ease, knowing that somebody might understand their situation better. Is she strong enough to do this? Or you couldn't carry my husband out of a fire, which my response is, he got himself in the wrong place if I have to carry him out of a fire.
Okay,
But
so
yeah.
that was a PSA done a few years ago by the assistant fire chief in LA, who, for those who are just on audio, she's a black woman of size, I guess you could say. I'm told she's a lesbian. That's you can't. It's not. It doesn't say lesbian on the screen.
Yeah, I know. So it does look like a lesbian, but still.
Right.
But, the reason that a lot of us are it's very straightforward why we're angry, because it's like when your fire is burning down, I don't really care if you're like an alien. Right. I want someone big and strong and effective, and all of that stuff is just, it's retarded, and the thought here is, okay, a lot of people saw that PSA and they approved it. Why? Well, because they deferred to this person because, well, I mean, I don't think internally they actually did believe that it gives people ease, but they're not going to say no to a black lesbian. Okay? That's what happened. That's why this stuff got through, because everyone looked at each other like, well, it's a black lesbian. What are we going to say? We don't want to be homophobic and racist. Right. So let's approve it. So they approved a PSA where on the face of it is just ridiculous. In fact, it probably, not in fact, the reality is it's enraging to a lot of people. When your house is burning down, unless you're even if you are a neo-Nazi, you see what I'm saying? Let's say you're a neo-Nazi and your house is burning down and your family is still partly, and it's you see huge black men running, or small white men, and you have to make a choice. What are you going to do? How racist are you? And the reality is,
Gary Taylor,
in that moment, your racism is on hold until your family is safe, and then you can start throwing down the N-word, afterwards. Do you see what I'm saying? It's you would thought to it. We don't have to we can think about this philosophically. This makes no sense. But the issue is people didn't think. They acted, right, and they reacted, and that's what was happening. And I will say another thing, example like this, because a lot of people are not online like us, and I wrote something about crime. I think it was in the spring of 2022. I about the murder spike, and it was reported a little bit, but the New York Times had not decided to make it a big narrative thing.
Right.
This is spring of 2020, or it was 2021 or 2022. When I wrote that, I got a lot of messages. Wow, you're pretty courageous to write that. Right. Because somehow people were scared to talk about murders going up because I guess that would be racist. I have no idea. But there was an atmosphere, a chilling of all the discourse, because you just don't know. For example, that guy at USC who got fired from his instructor position. I think it was a accountant professor, because he and there's something related to Chinese. There's some Chinese element to it.
Yeah, it was. I don't know if it was linguistics or something. He was talking about filler words.
Yeah, so Chinese nega.
Yeah.
Okay? And so if you listen to Chinese people, you will hear that word. Okay. And so they were like, oh, it sounds too much like, the N word. Yeah. Okay, this is just retarded. But people were just so scared they went along with it, right?
Right.
And so that was the atmosphere that we had. Now, there's definitely a backlash. I think a lot of people are getting really comfortable just saying retard and all these other words, partly because they're just really irritated that they had to listen to this stupid stuff for years and years and years. So it's just pent up I don't want to say antisocial behavior, but just, people are like lashing out. And it's really fun, I think. I mean, I don't do it too much because I've always kind of been offensive. But like there are people where I can tell that they are dunking on people saying, you can't say that. And they're like going harder and dunking harder because they're just like, oh fuck, I can say this. Yeah. I can just, the glee is like very, very obvious. It's not very edifying, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And this is, I think, a cyclical thing in American cultural political life. You have periods like in the 60s or whatever, where these norms kind of like pop up and then people get sick of them. And then there's a period where they recede and there's backlash. There was a kind of proto political, like wokeness is really the same thing, in my opinion, as political correctness, which there was a bit of a like proto political correctness surge in like the early 90s. And then there was backlash to that. And I mean, I sort of think that in politics, it's any weapon at hand, So if you are a black woman or a black man or a gay man or whoever, and you can win an argument by quote unquote playing the race card or doing intersectional stuff or that woman, I mean, she's saying stupid, like not only stupid stuff, but like the thing about you can't carry a man out of a burning building, and your response is to say
insultingly offensive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes no sense because, like, I mean, yes, if I need to be carried out of a burning building, obviously I'm in the wrong place. That's what the fire department is for. Like, you don't call the fire department because you're having like a chill, good time. But obviously, that's the sort of thing where it's like she's implicitly invoking, like her intersectional Pokemon points. And so I'm sure, even though it's objectively very stupid and even offensive and contrary to the very purpose of a fire department, maybe she said that and like people were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? You go, girl. You really told that man who was concerned about the fact that you can't actually do your job and carry him out of the building. And people will do that if they can get away with it, And now I think part of what we're seeing in a lot of cases is there are people who got promoted based on the fact that people who got promoted or put into positions who frankly are not that smart, who in a lot of cases are kind of venal, maybe corrupt, but who got away with it by relying on these sorts of tactics. And now the tactics don't really work anymore. And so, they're kind of left naked, they're exposed in terms of like, they don't have a defense anymore for like when they screw up.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So a couple of things. This reminds me of Bob Wright. I think it might have been 2008. It was a long time ago. Michelle Obama was saying something at some event where she was like, I'm finally proud to be an American.
Yes,
it was 2008, right?
Yeah. It was while Barack was running. Yes.
Well, the issue here is, or not the issue. Bob Wright, who he does blogging heads at the time. He's liberal, but he's old guy, and he kind of like plays it straight ahead. And basically, he called out, I think, what the issue here is, like Michelle Obama in her social circles, she always got identitarian deference. Right. So, like, among the white liberals of Chicago that she would, hang out with, they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, But she was speaking now to a broader audience, and so Barack Obama and his team had to do some damage control there, because within certain circles, you do get identitarian deference, and other circles you don't. What happened in 2020, and I have to say, like, I was, we were friends then, like, yes. I think you remember, I was really disgusted by the Republicans for basically just like cucking.
Cowering.
Yeah, and like honestly, I just like I will say I'm much more enthusiastic about I was much more enthusiastic about Trump in 2024 than 2020, partly because Like, I don't really care, like, all of his, like, media accolades. Like, those were a tough 4 years, personally, for a lot of people that were, like, people around me. And I had some professional issues. I don't want to get into the details. But basically, like, they were persecuting us. It was like a culture war. And Trump was not, maybe he couldn't do anything. That's fine. But, like, the reality is he was exacerbating it. And the left was, like, on the march. And the Republican Party, I mean, okay, in Trump's defense, at least he didn't totally cave to him. But, like, Mitch McConnell is, I mean, I don't even know how he managed to bend the knee, you know. Doing these things, I asked people, like, I've told this story, I've asked people in the Senate staff, like these younger guys, I was like, what are you guys going to do? And they're like, nothing. I mean, they weren't playing it because they were happy. They're like, no, nothing's going to happen. They're just like, they don't think that they have any effect on the culture and the politics and downstream of culture and all that. They were like totally, just like had surrendered in every way. And that was where we were in 2020. And there were these private group chats and people were just trying to like make do. And if you read some of the stuff that I wrote, even I have read it, it was pretty dark. Although I do have to say, I thought this was going to last for 5 to 10 years. It's a little shorter than that. People like Richard Hanania thought it was going to be like 50 years. Like people were just like,
they just thought people who were like, oh, this is just, not only is it never going to end, but this is the inevitable, consequence of the American Revolution or whatever.
Yeah, like some people like they just take the black pill and they go into a black hole.
Right, yes, right.
It's just like, well, like, and I think part of it, age does help because as you said, we remember a little bit of the political correctness craze and the reaction. We're a little too young to remember the 1970s and 80s reaction to basically the late 70s, early 80s. That was when we were too small, but we actually were born at the beginning of a cultural counter revolution. Because if you read about, and like now you go back and read or you talk to boomers, a lot of these things that happened in 2020, they were already present in the minds of radicals in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah.
And they tried to execute them in certain ways, but it was much more small bore and like, kind of like pilot projects is the way I'm going to think about it, because the culture was not radicalized. They laid the groundwork and then they executed on it. Another thing I do have to say, and this is really shocking to my moderate Democrat friends, because I have like moderate Democrat friends, and they don't know this. It's hidden from Black Lives Matter was a communist movement. Like it was in their platform. Right. Like they wanted to abolish the nuclear family. They're Marxists.
Right.
Yeah. And that was just like there on the interwebs in 2019 and 2018. They scrubbed it, but you can find it in archives. Like, I would show it to people and they'd be like, oh, because they thought that I was just being hyperbolic.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, no. They literally have it there. Like they want to abolish the nuclear family.
Yes.
Right. So like this sort of stuff, they control the institutions and, everything they spoke, like, I think some people like my friend Leighton Woodhouse calls it the blue blob. They speak with one voice, like some marching orders come from on top. And all of a sudden, like, for example, like the gender thing, all of a sudden that was very quick. Because like in the 2004,
yes,
Jon Stewart was making like chicks with dick jokes,
right,
and then he had to do like a little bit of like reconsider his like feelings and struggle session about it. Like 15 years later, he's like, oh yeah, this is but it wasn't because he had like a new original thought. He developed it anyway. It was like a new order had come down from on high, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was even quicker than that. I remember there was a clip from the Bill Maher show it might have been 2019. And I know it had Bill Maher and Ronan Farrow was on and Dennis Prager was on. And Dennis Prager was talking about how, hey, look, if you go to like liberal college campuses, they are putting tampons in the boys' bathrooms because they believe that men menstruate, right? And Bill Maher and Ronan Farrow, all these guys are just like incredulous. It's like, what are you talking about? You're making that up. Like, that's obviously not true. This is like a stupid, talking point. And then of course, like within a year or two, like everybody's like, oh yeah, of course. Right. Like obviously, men menstruate. And now Bill Maher at least has kind of flipped back and, now he knows about it, but he's still incredulous. I don't know if anyone's asked Ronan Farrow what he thinks about it.
Ronan Farrow's kind of disappeared.
Yeah, he hasn't really done much, I would say.
I mean, I looked him up recently, and I think part of it is like he played fast and loose, and like people are embarrassed. I think journalism is embarrassed.
Yeah, perhaps. Journalists can be hard to embarrass sometimes, I guess. But
No, I just think that like you get assignments based on like your past performance and
right,
some of the stuff. Like obviously, like we don't need to like relitigate the Kavanaugh stuff.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear that he reported stuff that was like clearly false.
right.
And so I think the people that assigned him and promoted him are embarrassed about it. They're not going to do that for
Yeah.
a while. Anyway, that's the only. But yeah, because Ronan Farrow, he got he was like he was going to go to the top,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden he disappeared.
But yeah, I mean, so it did happen very quick and kind of a springboard. The spring back has happened, I would say, faster than I anticipated. I hope it like continues. Right now it still seems to have momentum, but there are these ideas of preference falsification and like preference cascades or whatever. There's a book like Private Truths, Public Lies by it's like Timur Kuran, I think.
Timur Kuran, yeah, he's Turkish.
Yeah.
Twitter, he tweets a lot. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah. I mean, he seems to be pretty, I don't think he voted. I don't think he voted for Kamala.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
No.
But yeah, so like a lot of this stuff, I do think it's just it can change very quickly because a lot of it was never that heartfelt. Like people were doing it out of social pressure, fear of punishment, just belief that this was like what all good people. It's like an Emperor's New Clothes type of situation. There's all sorts of metaphors. And so when you're in a situation like that, yeah, I think this is probably more true for more things than we even want to admit, where like people can just change their beliefs pretty radically, pretty rapidly. I mean, I'm sure in Germany in the middle of the 20th century, there were plenty of people who thought the Nazis were idiots. And then a few years later, thought Hitler was the greatest guy ever. And then a few years after that, thought, like the Nazis are totally evil.
Yeah.
Depending on where they lived, either thought the communists were evil or that the communists were the greatest ever, right? So a lot of people, their political and social beliefs are kind of malleable just based on what is socially normative. I think you just have to say that's kind of the default for most people to a large extent.
Yeah, I do have to say, like, sometimes like you value consistency, and sometimes you're like, it's going to change your mind. Like, I have a friend, and his grandmother, he's a half Japanese American and half. Well, his dad's third generation, I think, Japanese American, and his mom is a German immigrant.
Yeah,
his grandmother, grew up in Germany during that time. And, like, let's just say that she thought that there was a conspiracy to blacken the Führer's name. And so she would always like explain to my friend Kyle, like, they say bad things about the Führer, but when the Führer was in power, there was a chicken in every pot.
right.
And like I was like, and by the way, he married a Jewish woman. Like she met, his wife or soon to be wife, and she wasn't anti-Semitic. She just thought that like, the Allies had like lied about and to her dying day. One thing is, I used to read like memory research, and like there is memory research about like the opinions of white Southerners. It tracked like a longitudinal study from like I think like 65 to like 1985, like around that range.
Yeah.
And one of the things that it showed is people in white Southerners in 1985 reported quite accurately that only a minority of white people in the mid 60s in the South favored desegregation.
Right.
They're approximately right. And this was longitudinal, so they had tracked these people for like 20 years, and it turned out that like 80% of the people thought that about like 20% of the white population favor desegregation. I'm kind of making up the numbers, but it's like that, right?
Yeah.
Also, 80% of people were part of that 20%.
Right. Yeah.
And it was longitudinal because they showed how people were like switching their views at some point in the 70s. But the people themselves had forgotten that they were in the 80%, even though they remembered there was an 80-20 split. They had somehow re-edited, which, like, look, if you're a human being, you can kind of see that, because what's the accountability measure here except for your own whatever, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. And, like a lot of people, they don't think that deeply. And maybe, like, let's say you're a person who, okay, you're generally supportive of segregation, like it's 1964 or whatever. And, you think, well, I mean, the system kind of sucks for Black people. It would be nice if it could change. But also, there's a lot of dangers and risks if it changes. Like in your mind, you're thinking this. There's a lot of dangers and risks that it changes, and I don't think it's, it's too. And I don't like. I feel like these guys, who are coming down, are like agitators or communists or whatever. Okay, so in your mind, like people have all sorts of like conflicting or divergent thoughts. So then later on, you can look back on that and say, oh, well, I was never really for segregation because I could think about all these times where I had qualms about it or doubts about it, or I thought maybe that's not a good idea. And that progressively took over and became like my, public sincere view or whatever. But if somehow history had taken a different course, then you could look back and be like, well, I never doubted, there were a lot of people who were fair weather segregation fans, but not me, because I always thought, like the risks are too high and, MLK was like a communist or whatever, right? I think that's true for a lot of people because it's rare for a person to be like just 100%, like no nuance. And I don't know if that's rare.
Yeah.
A lot of people have like, yeah, they go back.
The world is filled with grays, not blacks and whites. Now there are black and white people, and sometimes like it's pretty shocking. So the late Fred Phelps, the God Hate Fags minister, was actually heavily involved in segregation stuff back when it wasn't popular from his class and his milieu.
Yeah,
So
Phelps. I think Phelps is a good example of like most people are kind of go along to get along, social conformists, and some people are not, right? And if you are like, I mean, Phelps is clearly a guy who, okay, everybody around me thinks segregation is good, but I don't give a crap what other people think, right? I think it's bad, and that can also mean everybody around me thinks that like homosexuality should not be stigmatized or whatever, but I don't give a crap about that, and probably in his mind, both of those views were also tied to his like views of the Bible, because, in like the Bible is clearly anti-racist in a lot of different ways. And it also does not speak highly of homosexuality, I would say.
yeah. Well, we'll move to the paywall section soon, but like I do want to say, I was going to mention this. At the time, a religious, not like a political magazine with a religious element is the way I'm going to say it, because it's not like a religious magazine. I asked him, I'm like, this whole like these communists, like race communists and stuff in 2020. I'm like, what are you Christians going to do about it? Because you guys have institutional power. And he was basically like, we're not going to do anything about the race communists because like Christianity really doesn't have like strong arguments. Well, Christianity, and basically he said it's harder for Christians to argue against like, uplifting the racially marginalized than, it would be other things. He's like, for example, like the gender and sex stuff.
Right.
It's like straightforward in the Bible that, there's a man and a woman and all this stuff, right? Yeah. But like the Bible doesn't have much to say. I mean, they're like some of the racialists are like, well, the Tower of Babel, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, you got to go pretty far back. And if you're a Christian as opposed to a Jew, like, no shade on the Jews, but like there is stuff in the Hebrew Bible, like, okay, like God said to separate, God said to do, you know what I'm saying? But then like, if you're a Christian, you read the New Testament, there's a few things where Jesus is a little harsh to Gentiles, but if you read the whole thing, it's really hard, I think, to be an honest person and say it doesn't come across as like very universalist,
Yes, right.
and it's not necessarily like not necessarily like, like radical communist document, but like it definitely leans towards the proposition that like the social constructions of this world are not like some sacred thing,
Right. Yeah.
So
And so I think it took longer and was harder, I would say, for like Christian or religious groups to kind of come to terms with that sort of like kindy, anti-racist BLM type of stuff. I do like you were totally right. The gender stuff was much easier for them to the point where, I mean, you mentioned it. It's true. BLM on their website was talking about wanting to abolish the nuclear family. And I did notice that in 2020, 2021, when people were critical of BLM, not just religious Christian people, but other people as well, but a lot of Christian people, like if they wanted to be negative on BLM, that's what they would point to, right? Because they'd be like, look, they're anti, they would like turn it into an argument about gender stuff or whatever, as opposed to saying, well, actually, Black Lives Matter, it seems like they actually get more Black people killed because, blah, blah, blah. Or, I mean, it's fine to say like police brutality or whatever, but they seem to have like racial animus against white people or whatever, those sorts of things. I think those sorts of arguments took longer to develop and mature and were harder for people to kind of go on, especially a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's move to that paywall section right now. I think I don't know, like if you have a topic, but I wrote this is editing right now. I wrote a very long piece for Palladium about Rotherham or the Grooming Gang.
Grooming Gang. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about that,
Sure. Yeah, of course.
fun topics, right? So basically, well, why don't you give like a high level summary of it? Hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to conversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' right. In civil discourse we can find the ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In this dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see the shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspects of the lyrics or discuss the theme?